Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to this conversation, if you will, on the subject, is New York competitive, sorting through what the rankings tell us. People love making lists, as you may have noticed. I know I do. And people love comparing things, people and things. So really, we're going to have a conversation today about the making of lists and the comparing of things. And we're going to try to reach some conclusions, or at least gain some insights into what lists and comparisons might tell us about public policy and about the policy directions we're moving in here in New York State. And along those lines, it was interesting to me that in his first State of the State message, soon after he took office as governor a year ago, Governor Cuomo declared, among other things, we have the worst business tax climate in the nation, period. Now, he was actually referring, I believe, to the Tax Foundation's annual rankings of business climates in states. And at that point, the latest report had us ranked 50th. In 2011, the Tax Foundation came out with its new version of the report in which we had moved up to 49. So the governor, if he was to amend that comment today, could actually insert a comma and say that we have the worst business tax climate in the nation, comma, except for New Jersey. But, you know, of course, any of these types of lists or rankings or comparisons can be misleading. They risk being simplistic. And so it's important to understand what they say and don't say. But one thing that's striking to me, as somebody who's been looking at these lists and comparisons in one context or another for the better part of the last 30 years, is how consistently New York tends to rank very poorly on so many of them. In fact, there was a study done recently by a trio of professors out in California looking at this whole issue of business indexes and tax climate and economic climate indexes. And they compared two different types of indexes. One they called the tax and cost index type, and the other was the so-called productivity index type. And one measures how heavy your burden is, and the other measures how strong your economy is in absolute output terms. On the tax and cost indexes, of which there are quite a few, our average ranking in New York was 48.2. On the productivity index, our average ranking was 22, which is no better than mediocre. So when we break out of the pack and actually look pretty strong, it's news. And so in June, for example, the U.S. Chamber released its third annual survey of what it calls the enterprising states. And the survey is done by a consulting group, Praxis Strategies, which includes the distinguished demographer Joel Kotkin. And these are places that, in the words of Chamber President Thomas Donahue, have created an environment where private sector businesses, entrepreneurs, and capital are welcome and can grow and thrive. And lo and behold, after ranking 21st in the previous version of that survey, New York jumped 11 places and was ranked among what the study called 10 future boom states, their phrase, which were those best positioned to grow, create jobs, and prosper in the coming years. Now, the governor understandably, quite understandably, touted that finding. He said that although we still have work to do, this report highlights just some of the great strides our administration, in partnership with the legislature, has made. And a week later, I think it may have been just coincidence on this timing, but a week later, the governor and legislative leaders announced the beginning of the $50 million New York Open for Business ad campaign, which you've probably seen. And some of the groups represented in this room joined the governor in celebrating that ranking. Now, my purpose today isn't to quibble too hard about that. The mere fact that any administration is so eager to even be perceived as pro-growth, at a minimum, must be taken as a positive. Of course, then again, if you look at the Chamber study, what you find is that, like many such rankings, all of which have inherent limitations, it's backward-looking. So basically what that study actually said was that our improvement in the rankings was due to our rapid GDP expansion and per capita income growth, much of which has been driven by the rebound in high-value finance sectors. Well, as you know, the rebound in the high-value finance sector was driven post-2007 basically by federal bailouts. And the outlook for the finance sector is not terrific. So while it's an accurate measure in the short term of where we are, and while arguments can be made in favor of the governor's position that things have improved in terms of the state's attitude toward business, one might also argue that this ranking, like many others, is not necessarily dispositive. The whole thing, though, thinking about it, reminds me of an incident more than 25 years ago, which was early in my transition from being a newspaper reporter to being public relations director for the Business Council of New York State. And one morning I got a phone call from a reporter, a business reporter, about the latest of what was then one of the major rankings done in the United States, which was the Grant Thornton Index of Manufacturing Climates. Those of you who are of a certain age will actually, this will ring a bell with you. This was put out every year, made big news. So that the latest Grant Thornton ranking of manufacturing climates comes out, and New York ranks 46th. And ranking number 1 on the list is South Dakota. Now, my role with the Business Council, I could see some of the flaws in the ranking, some simplicities in the ranking, but also my role was to thread the careful line of saying things are getting better because of policies we've promoted, so we can't be that bad. Also, at that time, we had a mighty manufacturing sector, many of whose principal companies were members of the Business Council. So in the course of talking to that reporter, I said, obviously this index is a little simplistic because, South Dakota ranks number 1. What's South Dakota? I can clearly remember saying, it's a wasteland. Now, in those pre-internet days, things didn't get around that quickly, but they got around quickly enough. And the fact was that the reporter I was talking to wasn't just any business reporter, it was a reporter for the Associated Press. And so, that comment got around pretty quickly. And we were just looking yesterday, Nexus barely goes back that far, particularly when it comes to the Bismarck Journal or whatever it was. But as we found out the next day, my comment had made headline news in South Dakota, and where I had been personally denounced by, I believe it was Lieutenant Governor of South Dakota, because the governor was out of town. And this was literally, I think it led the business page, if not the whole paper. I was kind of nervous for about an hour and a half till I found out that my bosses at the Business Council weren't the least bit upset with the fact that I had made news by wising off about South Dakota. And I do remember another aspect of this, which I was able to refresh my memory on yesterday, which was we preferred at the time, there was a richer series of rankings that was done by the Council on Enterprise Development. You probably know that group. And they did a totally different kind of report card. They called it a report card on economic development and growth in states, and it was more multifaceted and assigned grades for different things. And their report card, in fact, had different rankings. And I found an article, in fact, that there was a man named Robert Friedman, who was the head of the chief researcher for the Council on Enterprise Development. And he was quite hostile about the Grant Thornton survey. He said the definition of a good business climate purveyed by Grant Thornton is not only destructive and pervasive, it is wrong. He also said that, not surprisingly, the rankings turn out to be poor predictors of economic performance. It's California, New York, and Massachusetts, those highly taxed, highly regulated, unionized states, which had scores of 26, 42, and 27, respectively, which consistently boast the most vital model economic climates in the country. It ignores this study, he further said, ignores the needs of the very businesses creating jobs, new and expanding, young and smaller firms. So I saw that, and I looked at the ranking that Mr. Friedman had worked on, in fact, which was the report card on states. This was in the mid-'80s, okay? This is 1985. 2 years later, CED began doing its own report card, where, sure enough, New York ranked fairly high. New York received an overall B, received A's in many categories. Well, that got me thinking. I realized I'm a pretty old guy, been around a long time. A lot of time has passed since then. I wonder what happened. So I went back and I looked at what's been the private job growth record of the states since the mid-1980s. 1985, as we didn't know at the time, was the beginning of the most explosive, prolonged post-war economic expansion in the nation's history. So from 1985 to mid-2012, the United States private sector job base, and this is net of the recession losses also, net private sector employment in the United States grew by 37%. Now, net private sector employment in California grew by 33%. Net private sector employment in Massachusetts grew by 11%. Massachusetts is still capable of growing over a long period, even if it's not as dynamic as California. Michigan's growth in jobs during that period, that's a 27-year period, 14%. New York has grown New York's private sector job base from 1985 to 2012 has grown 15%. It's 1 million jobs. There's 1 million more private sector jobs in New York now than there was when I called South Dakota a wasteland in 1985. And what of that wasteland, South Dakota? Job growth in South Dakota since 1985 has been 73%. I don't have a little slide on this, but let me say that figure again. The national average was 37. The best of the big, heavily developed, heavily unionized, regulated, high-tax states was California with 33%. South Dakota grew by 73%. Now, of course, we know the law of numbers. South Dakota is a small place. Its economy, as of now, is roughly the size of the capital districts. Nonetheless, the wise guy who called it a wasteland was off a bit. So that's an interesting thing to think about. Grant Thornton wasn't as unpredictive as Mr. Friedman, wherever he is, and I don't mean to pick on him, said it was. So there's a lot of things to think about in looking at indexes. Are they predictive or are they a portrayal? Do they suggest factors that businesses need to think of when making plans to grow or expand or develop in a particular state? And what do they imply for policy, last but not least, which is our focus?